Mr. Mangurian has received numerous Progressive Architecture Awards, including a recent 1983 citation for their Venice Art Center, which was exhibited this summer at Bernard Jacobson Gallery. Robert Mangurian is also involved in education. He's been on a fellowship to the American Academy and currently has an interest in developing there an independent atelier for a select group of students from across the United States. And he teaches. He's been doing so for about 14 years, first in New York and currently, as most of us know, at UCLA. In tonight's lecture, Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep. Mr. Mangurian will use his projects and theory to promote a particular view about the making of architecture, that it is more simple than we make it, and that some basic principles are being sidestepped. With pleasure, we welcome Robert Mangurian.
How do you clip this on? You don't need to. These lights are what is this stuff here? We're going to be able to string this out for 3 or 4 hours. How long was Hertzberger's talk last year? This is a popular item. Have you changed the framework a few of these? That circle, windows. This is actually okay. They said I could use this as a pointer. Well, hopefully this won't be as pretentious as it will sound, or as long as I appear to be making it. A few opening remarks. One is that the work is that I'll be showing is largely not my own, and until the end, really the second half. I think it's supposed to be slightly theoretical to start out with. That's apparently what we do these days. But it's going to look a lot like a travelogue, an Italian travelogue. So bear with that, or I'll probably enjoy it. Also, the work that you will see later on is the result of, except for two projects, a true collaboration between Craig Hodgetts, who has not abandoned the field of architecture, but gone, it seems to say he includes it, as well as chasing starlets around the movie sets. In this case, it's a movie set in Virginia, making a 3D horror show rock and roll thriller. He says it's more important than making buildings. Also, if we could turn this side off, this hideous mess, or maybe it's not that important. Oh, and I'm supposed to run this. I can run half of it. Maybe that's all right. Leave that on. And I will also, I guess the other thing I might say is that the series, as it was presented to me, was a discussion of the relationship between art and architecture. That's what we thought about earlier in this summer. I've talked to, or certainly I have a number of friends who are artists, and I've talked to them on many occasions about what is that relationship, and they no one has the foggiest idea, except that both sides seem to think that the other side's more fun. The person that you'll be hearing next week claims that he'd rather be an architect, or I don't know about being an architect, but he'd like to thinks architecture is more interesting, and boy, I personally would like to be able to be 22 years old, well, as you would too, and sell my drawings or paintings for $15,000 to $20,000 each. Maybe the true relationship between art and architecture. Well, I don't know whether I can reveal this, but I recently in New York, I was escorting a woman to dinner in which there were a lot of, actually both, it was a public restaurant, but there were a number of artists and architects seated at various tables who she seemed to know most of the artists, and I seemed to know, well, there was only one other architect, Andrew Beatty. And we went from there to a disco. I don't know what you do at discos. The artists seem to have a lot of time. I don't seem to have any time to do that. And so they're all there at the disco. And so I just sort of sit against the wall, and I'd just been down in New Orleans, and I was learning how to drink gin and tonic, so I thought that's something you do, and so I was doing a lot of that. And I turned around and noticed the young lady sitting way up in the bleachers with her arms around one of those young 22-year-olds who sells his paintings for $15,000 to $20,000. So I think that may be the relationship somehow. I don't know. Let's get more serious. This is Mr. This might be in there. This is an architect, Mr. Woolworth, or not Mr. Woolworth, Cass Gilbert, who, as you know, is the most famous architect in the world around the turn of the century. Who is he? and this is Mr. Woolworth. The two of them collaborated. How do you collaborate? One person puts up the money and the other person designs the building? I guess it is a collaboration of sorts. Well, they built the tallest building in the world. It was the tallest building for about 20 years. The most famous building in the world for 20 years, the Woolworth Building, which, of course, we don't even know about. President Wilson from the White House, please, I read this at every time. It reminds me how pitiful it reminds me of something. President Wilson from the White House in Washington gave the signal for the formal opening of the new Woolworth Building last night, tallest structure in the world, with the one exception of the Eiffel Tower. Is it a building? And so on, the question. Okay. At 7:29, when the 900 guests who had been invited by the owner, Frank W. Woolworth, to a dinner in honor of the architect, Cass Gilbert. Today it's in honor of the contractor, but with my first building, it was a dinner in honor of the contractor. Were seated at the tables on the 29th floor. A telegrapher of the Western Union, which is newly formed, stationed there, notified the operator in the White House that all was ready for the president to push the button. 1 minute later, President Wilson touched the instrument, closing the circuit, which caused a bell to ring in the banquet hall and in the engine room 30 stories below. Immediately, and for the first time, lights flashed on every floor of the 55 stories, from the sub-basement 37 feet below street level to the top of the tower, 792 feet above the street. After the president pressed the button, a toast was drunk to him, and the orchestra played the Star-Spangled Banner. In addition to this, and now I'll paraphrase, the Woolworth Company had arranged with the Marconi Company to make they had made an arrangement so that when the president pushed the button to light the lights in the building, a message of the opening was flashed immediately to the Eiffel Tower wireless station, and from there relayed to all the European capitals. The message was also flashed to the ships at sea. The times have changed, so much so that when I first gathered these sets of slides together, the landing on the moon was an exciting thing, and even that is past. I guess it's the Go-Go's tour of the United States or whatever. Now, if I'm doing this in some other city, I tell people this is where I live, but since so many of you know I have no place to live, I can't pull that off. This is the home of the three, not the three wise men, the mother and the father, and the father and the son both seem to play a lot of poker. And the old man with the bifocals, his house. That weird person with the eyes are too small. And this, I can't speak too highly of this young lady who lives here. But this is where, this is supposed to be revealing, I guess. Also, if we can focus these. Jeez. And this is where we work. What a mess. And I guess I'm going to do this technique. It's a Vincent Scully technique. At our school, the secretary thinks Vincent Scully is a baseball announcer. She's a Dodger fan. So when I do that, that means you switch those big ones. Okay. I'm going to first try to talk about, in a kind of vague way, what went wrong. And this will be a kind of wild, theorizing overview, inaccurate, but hopefully if you don't listen to what I'm saying too much and just look at the slides, you'll get it to some extent, as much as I'm getting it. Another art story, at the same trip in New York 3 weeks ago, one of the leading art gallery owners confided to me. Well, I said, how are things going, and blah, blah, things are going okay. And then she said, hey, you know, this is a big problem now these days. She said, I just don't know, I don't know what art, I don't know what, who I should be showing. I can't tell, I can't distinguish, I can't tell the difference. And it is a time where people are really searching and somewhat confused. I think some of that confusion comes about because of the fact that we are being led to some extent by not by the work itself, but by the publication, the media, whatever, even events like this. That's just a little sermon. I guess in earlier times things were clear. If you ruled the world, you put within your city at almost the center a building which was for your gods, and you made it into a simple form that represented both those gods and the cosmos. When that broke down, and you had you ended up having smaller versions of it, less perfect centers, but certainly still there and protected from the outside. With a safer world, man was permitted to describe his relationship to the world in a symbolic and more idealized way, not in a practical way like a fortification, but in an ideal way, as this is. And now I jump 400 years. Perhaps two events, but obviously more, but I'll just describe two that seem very important, change things. And this slide portrays actually both. One is a much increased production and interest in production of all sorts, articles, cars, airplanes, television sets, etc., as you know, and much improved communications. In the old days, there were waiting rooms for salesmen, and this advertisement describes how the waiting room, that part of a building, that part of a piece of architecture which supports this activity of carrying on commerce, of presenting your goods to the owner of the company, the waiting room, or in more general terms, the architecture is no longer required. You can merely pick up a telephone and call the person, and in fact get ahead of all the other people in line. That's and we changed our symbol of man now, instead of at the center of the world and at the center of a symbolic representation of the world, that man is now being marked, measured, and described by how quickly that the person can produce. The time motion studies, in fact, preceded this Korb diagram of the size of man. make our buildings according to the dimensions of man, so that man can be a better, more efficient producer. And instead of the king in his castle, every man has his own castle. In addition, Woolworth Buildings, the most famous building for many years, and other pieces of architecture are no longer exciting us as much. And symbols, graphic symbols of whether they're events, people, political parties, or carbonated soda, this is, in our minds, is possible to translate into a Coca-Cola sign. Replace and are much more powerful than what our buildings can do. And the society obviously caught on because they lost interest in the making of buildings. This could be really depressing. Those images were mass-produced. And then there's perhaps even another facet to this, which is beyond just increased communications, and maybe it's a third important event of the 20th century, which has to do with an interest in computing and in keeping track of the world through various systems. Obviously, these systems, the early ones are mathematics and other notational systems. Language, in fact, is one of these. Is a way of keeping track of the world in ways that are far more complicated than we as people can do comfortably. God, it's like a little tyrant here doing this. Who is this person? The semiconductor or the integrated circuit, the chip, made form and makes form, and continues to make form in our society somewhat irrelevant. And in a funny way, our cities start to look a lot like the thing which allows the city to take place like this. Our city is a kind of computing system. We found out it could be a computing system. You no longer needed to have a center because as a simple person walking around, you kind of need something there to relate to that's very simple. And when there are thousands and thousands of centers, no longer as a person, your instincts no longer hold, and you need some way of figuring it out. So I live on 822 Wilshire Boulevard or whatever, or I'm on the 34th floor, room 502. You can find that, but it's not something that you instinctively can find. You can only find through this computing system. And this super studio kind of projection of that is that our Earth is covered with this anonymous, continuous building intersecting the landscape. The human is reduced to only a brain and perhaps a nervous system. Do we have it? And we started very naturally and in fact in a very excited way making buildings like that. Here at Berlin Free University, which is a kind of continuous field of spaces and places, but they're quite anonymous. And it was thought to be important because how do you know if the geography department is not going to combine, I don't know how you do this, with the physics department sometime, and if they're next to each other, let's try biology and physics, that you don't know whether the two fields are going to combine or whether one is going to overlap another one to whatever extent. And so we said it's not good to make separate buildings, it's not good to make separate objects, it's not good to separate these things anymore and let them all mold together. The problem is, of course, that we then, as people, as simple people, we can no longer find our way. And our buildings, in fact, sometimes become completely anonymous and reflect only older images of buildings, and often they're thought to be completely expendable. An incredibly interesting incident to me occurred last year when I went out to Caltech. I was quite excited. A friend had a brother that was doing very high-level research on the way vision works in the brain, experimenting with monkeys. He says it keeps them alive, but the way they looked was marginal. Anyways, so I had never been to Caltech, and I was quite excited about going to this very important place where science is occurring. And we went out there, and we walk up into a hideous building, and up into one of the floors in which there's no circulation system on the floor once you got off of the stair. And because it's just been lots and lots of partitions have been put up. And then we finally wander back into a certain area, and there are a few tables set up, and a little chair where the monkey sits, and a little screen and some gaffer's tape, and a kind of small computer hooked into a larger computer through telephone lines and coaxial cables. And I realized that making architecture for this activity, which was very important, a very important one, was obviously irrelevant in terms of the practicality of supporting this experiment, because the experiment could occur there, it could occur here, it could occur in that environment, or it could occur in this, again, super studio sort of fantasy environment in a desolate area, as long as you have that machinery to support you. So where does that lead us? I don't have the answers. I was trying to have someone remember this little Bo Peep who has lost her sheep, and no one seems to know the words. No one can tell me whether her fleece is white as snow. I think it's another rhyme, but we had disagreement about that. We've forgotten that part. But she's lost her sheep, and no one knows where to find them. Leave them alone, and they'll come home wagging their tails behind them. Maybe, what does that mean? What a loon's up here. I won't try to explain it, except to say that two things. One is, I think we fuss with our architecture too much. Our world is very complicated, and we try to make our architecture as complicated as the world is. Machines can understand the world. We can look into a kind of machine, another computing machine, a telephone book, or call up someone and an operator and find out the address or phone number of someone else many miles away. But we can't go outside and yell to that person, and we can't understand that complexity by ourselves. We need these additional tools. So I think if our buildings, this is a gross exaggeration here, if our buildings are so complicated that they require computing machines to understand them, or books to interpret them, I think we've gone astray. And I think that perhaps in a world which is quite complicated, that we need to, our architecture, again, does not need to concentrate on dealing with that complexity, because our electronics, perhaps, I'm simplifying again, but we have other ways of dealing with that complexity. And our architecture maybe can concentrate on some more basic things that have to do with us as human beings. And that's and perhaps, and we haven't gotten very far with it, I think, in our work, but perhaps it means searching for some origins and searching for some more basic values that our architecture can express. Because when we look around the world, we see that these are not being expressed in our other forms. They're not being expressed in our politics. They're not being expressed in our Coca-Cola advertisements, et cetera, et cetera. And there are some basic human values and basic things about the human condition which can perhaps be stated in our architecture and make us feel at home, something to cling on to. There was a wonderful, and for me, influential article by 3 psychologists. It's a hideous field, psychology, but these people happen to think of one good thing. It was an article called 7 ± 2, and it had to do with the fact that we, and some of you probably read this article, that we can understand as human beings. We can remember 7 numbers. When you tell us to remember 38 numbers in a row, we can't do it. We can have a machine that does it, but we can't do it ourselves. When we have a seminar, we feel comfortable with 7 or 8 or 10 people in the room, but when we have 14, 15, or 20, we no longer can have a conversation. Does that have something to do with how we were brought up for thousands and thousands of years of our family size and for our tribal size and so on? I think we can't shake those roots, and I somehow think our architecture needs to respond to those basic qualities and not rely so much on the complexity which is possible today with having rooms, 58 rooms on the 44th floor. What does that mean, or how do we deal with it? God, this got really serious here. Now this will be some more gross overstatements of an idea or some ideas. There are 3 ideas which I'll just really briefly go through. One has to do with, well, I guess all 3 of them have to do with a very simple thing, or it can be related to a very simple thing, like going into a room as an individual. And you go into the room with a purpose. The first thing that you do is locate yourself in that room in relationship to the room itself, or to the space, and to the other people. The second thing you do is to orient yourself, once you've located yourself, to the room and to the rest of the people. And the third thing that you do is to begin in some way to speak to the other people, either by yelling at the top of your lungs, or quietly talking to the person next to you, or not saying anything. These 3 next 3 series of slides talk about that in terms of buildings to some extent. A very primitive gesture in the making of architecture was to locate, well, obviously the first one was for a person to, a leader of a tribe, to walk on or lead his tribe to a certain point and then stop and place his staff on the ground and say, this is where we'll be. Again, there seems to be no more important gesture or move you can make in architecture than that. This is where we'll be. This is where my building will be. Or this is where your building will be. The monuments like this were built to mark crossroads, to mark spots on the earth. This one is in China. It became, I don't know what the story is here, but a turtle carries this one around. But it's been locked into a space. So the object has been placed in a kind of sacred space, marking an important spot of some sort. Obviously, the Egyptians and Romans and all primitive cultures did this. They marked spots or centers that had some importance in terms of their location. And we made buildings this way. In fact, I think many of the early buildings were this way, not the general sort of population, but a building which had more importance in some way. It became often tower-like. And pretty soon, whole cities got built this way. When there was no longer a need to really mark those spots of importance because your city was well organized and running, and people knew where these places were. Still, monuments, a kind of memory of that primary gesture were left and were placed in certain spots so they could be seen in order to remind people, I think, of where they came from. And I think it was often not conscious, but a kind of unconscious and a need people had. If these things weren't there, they felt disconnected from their past, disconnected from their roots, and then somehow aimless. And we did the same thing in our own country. And then in funny ways, when we build our city halls or important government buildings, we seem to feel the need to do this same thing, to mark the place. This works quite well. The second gesture, and these probably aren't in very good order here, or in fact very well thought out, I think, but these things, I don't know, I just am kind of feeling my way a bit on these things. Another important gesture is this mark, which is a cross with a circle around it, and in a more primitive form, it's just the cross itself. The cross itself, of course, refers to our own bodies, our body and our arms outstretched. I found this summer in a little rock shop in Taos, these crystals, which they mean nothing to architecture, but I found them interesting. They form this perfect X, and the woman who was selling them, and she seemed quite knowledgeable, said that they form themselves in the earth, pointing north-south, east-west, to magnetic north. And as you well know, our cities were made in this form, or excuse me, organized in this form. Why? One reason, because it's from our point of view, it's convenient and it lets us organize things. But from a more primitive point of view, it's a kind of primal way of first trying to organize something in relationship to your own body. This is where is it? A Roman city, I think, in France. At the center is both an object and a space. A Chinese city. This is a Mexican city. And this is a Renaissance interpretation of this very simple organizing and very important gesture of the cross, or the cross axis. This is the city of Pienza, and the main street runs east-west. Well, I can't say east-west for sure. It runs one direction, the main axis, from one gate to the other gate. And along the cross-axis are located the two most important buildings, the church and the city hall, which is down at the foot of the slide, bottom of the slide. On the right-hand side is located the Prince's Palace, which this is a slide of here. And on the, which faces catty-corner or at right angles to this building, which is the church. And Rossellino, the architect, thought that was an important thing to mark with the grid of the pavement, the grids coming from the structure and the organization of the two buildings, which is brought out, and the center is marked by this circle. I mean, it's not a heroic effort, but it's marked, and the buildings in this town are organized according to this very simple cross-axis. The cross-axis gives the location of these buildings significance and meaning. And this is an American city. Many of our, as you know, many of our cities have the same kind of organization, especially the cities in the Midwest between the two coasts. Doing the building in Ohio, the Southside settlement, for so many years, we got to know that city quite well, which had exactly this organization. The east-west road, the east-west axis, was the axis of movement, the commercial axis, which connected the East Coast to farther west, finally to the West Coast. The north-south axis was the axis of the residential part of town. And if you were a wealthy person or a person with more means, you would live on the north side of the town so that your house, receiving the sun from the south, could have its front door facing the center of the town. And if you were less fortunate, you would live on the south side of town. And then if you wanted your house to face the center of the town, it would never get the sunlight or would not be properly oriented. And finally, this is a small or a ceiling at the Villa Caparola, which is the building is a pentagon, and at the point of the pentagon, before you go out into the gardens, there's a single room, which is a square room made all of wood. The rest of the rooms in the palace are made of stucco and plaster. But this one room, which is seen to be the room which takes you from the man-built object or the building itself back to nature, is the one room which is made of wood. And the ceiling of that room, there is this symbol of the cross-axis, the kind of origin. And then I don't know whether this is finally, but and maybe this should actually come first, but it has to do with a very early, the very earliest making of architecture, which I'll again wildly theorize on, which has to do with most likely living in finding a shelter, not making a shelter, but finding one in a cave, and the only element of the architecture which is perhaps made or altered is the doorway itself. And later on, when you started making your own walls and you had to reproduce that cave opening, the hardest thing you could do is to make the lintel over the portal itself, the thing that would support the rest of the wall above. And probably, originally they were probably made of wood because wood was lighter, but I don't know, the wood kept rotting and falling on your babies as they were crawling out the door or something. The people take it seriously, don't they? It's babies. I keep telling Eugene that it's harder to make buildings than it is babies. But he's made four babies with only, well, three buildings. How many buildings? After a while, you wanted to make that thing over the door out of a stronger material and a piece of stone. You couldn't lift it yourself, and so you had to gather a lot of people together, your family, and maybe also the whole tribe or the whole community. And it became a kind of celebration. And so the thing over the door, which is probably, or at least we can interpret it as an even more primal or more primitive gesture, which is the threshold, which is marking on the piece of ground a line and saying, I'm on this side and you're on that side. And I welcome you to step over the line and join me in some way. So the difficulty of making that, of lifting that large rock and putting it above the door was something that people felt had great importance, both for that, probably for that coming together, for the difficulty of doing it, and for what it represented. It represented many, many, many things. And it started to be celebrated as an architectural element, as an element in the making of buildings. It probably was the first element that was celebrated, that was marked, that in a sense was designed. In these Etruscan tombs, in order to support the wall above, you needed this large stone. In these Etruscan tombs, which are built into a cave, that the representation of that very early gesture, again, of making architecture, is denoted as a carving on the wall of this cliff. And in these Etruscan tombs, the actual opening to the tomb is below the portal, which is now represented as a drawing on the wall itself. But the drawing is not discarded in any way. It was thought to represent the most important part of or the essence, probably, of shelter and of sheltering, and of the transfer between life and death, or between private and public, or between your house and the outside. And in here, in a kind of little object which would be in the tomb itself, both the house and the portal are represented. The portal, in this case, again, drawn on the object, representing the house. And what I had always wondered about, until being a dunce, basically, about history and architecture, and I had looked at, I've been to Italy a number of times in the last 5 or 6 years, and I would look at these buildings done during the Renaissance and later, and wonder why they made their door frames that way. And at certain times, I thought that if you just brought the moldings up, I didn't know they had to have moldings, and so I said, okay, they have moldings. And if you brought the moldings up and just brought them around in a straightforward way, the way we make hollow metal door frames, that you would get this funny kind of angle of when the moldings change direction, and it would feel like the whole top is going to fall in. Well, that does occur, and that's one of the reasons why they project these door frames out. But obviously, after I had seen the Etruscan tombs and thought about it, as you probably all have done before, but being slow at this, realized that they were not mimicking, but carrying on a tradition of making and marking the door frame itself. And it certainly has great meaning. People look up. It being the representation also of the threshold is a good one, because you don't go around the world looking down at the ground, and in fact, it's to somehow mark the threshold with some decorated or elaborate item that people are going to walk on it anyways and ruin it. So to put it up higher, and also seeing that it serves as the keystone or the stone holding up the rest of the wall above the door, it seems like a good thing. God, I can say next. I think it's more intelligent. I'm not a caveman. Yes. What a joke. And then finally, one of the best things I've ever seen, and one of my favorite images, is this photograph by Ettore Sazza, an Italian designer, a wonderful old man, who with these 3 sticks and some wires made a door frame. This door frame happens to be one which lets you walk between lightness and darkness by its location, by its orientation, and by its form. Oh, I was supposed to say next. Well, there are many, many more principles or sort of origins of where our architecture and where we, in fact, we as people, and where our language comes from. I don't know them all. Those are 3, I think. And I think there are 3 which are important which I think we have to account for in our buildings. We can leave them out consciously in order to achieve an effect, but we can't leave them out carelessly, I think. And in fact, I think we would do well in this time of chaos and complication to put them back in order to give ourselves some order, so that we have a place to pile our video discs and telephone books and stereo sets and Maseratis, et cetera, et cetera. There are 2 or 3 other notions here which I'll sort of briefly touch on, hopefully briefly touch on, which also we find important in our buildings. After all, the surprising thing is that when I finally do show you some architecture, you won't see any of what I've talked about in the work itself, which may cause some problems. But that's always the case. What's a poor man to do? The idea of, just as the idea of object has disappeared or appeared to be, or appears in our society today to not be important, and it is not important. It is not important to the organization of our society. It's not important in terms of the functioning of it, but it may be important in terms of its spiritual connection and just as the object has disappeared, space also has disappeared. And I've kind of combined a kind of description here of perhaps a way of thinking about objects, and also a way of thinking about spaces, so they can somehow reappear. This is not very thorough, and in fact it touches just briefly on the making of space itself. This was the first version of Southside, which both made the object and the space very much like the city, a photograph of the city of Los Angeles, or Berlin Free University, if you will, or the Super Studio City, or that computer chip. The space and the building are a series of layers the space flows from one to another. You don't know where one place is or another place. One place ends, another place begins. It was felt important to do this at a certain time, I think, in our development in making architecture, because the people that had the large objects, or had the important objects, and had the important spaces, had the spaces that were powerful, were the people that were also ruling over your life, and for a kind of more socially, well, in order to somehow equalize us, a more democratic life, we needed to somehow get rid of those important spaces and those important objects, because they were things that could be taken over by, or in fact were made by, the rulers, often despots, et cetera, et cetera. So 20th century architecture has been largely trying to not try to make architecture and space so that it's not there, because if it's not there, or if it's there in a very complicated way, no one can seize upon it in a way. A good example of this, geez, I can pass Hertzberger up really easily at this rate. A good example of this is in recent times are the two campuses or two of the campuses of the University of California, the Berkeley campus and the I tell the same stories over and over. The Berkeley campus, what was that? No, the Berkeley campus and the UCLA campus. The UCLA campus has no place, place or object which is central. The Berkeley campus, on the other hand, has this phenomenal spot, which is at the edge of the campus, on axis with the most important commercial street in the city, or it became the most important commercial street. And what's located there is a large space. Facing off each other in that space is a student building and the university building, or the administrator's building. And the final side of that square is a bridge which leads to the education. And in that place is where the free speech movement started. It was a place which had real identity, real strength, and real meaning by what was located on it, a cross-axis again, and a spot was in fact marked in that space, a kind of silly spot, a fountain that they used to put soap suds in, and there was some dog that used to run around in there. I don't know. But the dog found it, so that must mean something. I'll skip by this primitive hut business. We've had enough of that. But I think there's some importance to it. I think a great deal of importance to it. And I'm going to largely show here, uncommented on, buildings or objects, buildings and objects, which seem to have some identity, some clarity. The ones I'll show are not, are more like this, not perfect, and yet they have some reference to a more perfect way of making a building, or a simpler way of making a building. And next on the large. Whoop. Is a part of a church in Bergamo, a more complicated building, but made up of a number of smaller, simpler buildings, each one a simple shape. Two spaces. This one is in Gubbio. Buildings on three sides. The main building on the left-hand side of the slide is the town hall, and then the town itself unfolds on the fourth side of the space. And the main street of the town runs left to right on the slide. And this is a leftover space in is where Lucca, where that olive oil comes from, which is a Roman amphitheater. Left the space itself so strong, or I guess really a coliseum or amphitheater makes a difference. The space itself so clear and so strong that it just lasts and lasts and lasts. You don't destroy it because it's always there. You know when you're destroying it, or you know when you're affecting it. There are two things about it. One, it seems to be a pleasant space. Two, it's so clearly stated that you know when you're changing it. Now, there are ways to make spaces which are much more complicated than this, a simple oval, or it could have been a circle, even simpler, in which case you wouldn't know when you're destroying it, because it seems to have a lot of flying walls and twisted axes and I don't know, all the things that everybody seems to like to do. But you don't, it doesn't seem to, it certainly doesn't seem to have an identity of its own to the point where these spaces and these objects are continually mucked around with and destroyed in some way. This was, well, this space has, to tell a short story here, has a great ability to provide an echo. And at 11:30 one evening, after having a wonderful meal in this town, we went to this space, three of us, or four of us, and tested out the echo by clapping one's hands. And a little boy, and then made some little noise like boop, made a nice echo back. And a little boy up in a window started to, obviously he lived there all his life, but he understood this space too. And he yelled back and started singing opera. And we would chant back some mumbling kind of opera back and kept this guy going. At which point, everybody in the entire square, we'll call it oval, poked their heads out the window at 11:30 at night and started yelling at the kid to get back in the window and go to sleep. Angelo, you're at this again. But it was a, and they probably hated the place, but it was a real place. Now we back and forth, back and forth. We're switching here. The slide, the large slide here is a City Hall in Montepulciano, located again on the main street of the town, and there's a main square here, and the cross-axis runs in a very wonderful way through this town hall to, as you can just barely see, a little window and a balcony that looks over the land itself. So the end of that axis has meaning in terms of the town. And then I'm going to show some silly sort of images here of, with very little comment, of what I think at the moment are one. We obviously are most sensitive to recognizing people and distinguishing amongst people than we are of other things like dogs and rocks. I mean, you look at one rock and next another rock, and I know they're all the same. And somehow, if we make our buildings look like rocks, and how do you tell one building from another building? How do you find your way here? It's a quieter way to do that. That's early, whoever you want to pin that on, early Disneyland. But note what's in the center of the space. These are some mostly Italian castles, or forts, really. Except that. These are single buildings, but they seem to be made up of parts which are like single buildings. The plan for which I just showed looks like this, a kind of a nondescript. Although you start to make out that it has 3 or 4 parts which conceivably would have some identity, each one, and they're all kind of glommed together. And when you start to see the building itself, it doesn't show well in the slide. The larger building has great personality. The little round building goes down to where this bridge is, and then it splays out in a kind of like a funnel, or a funnel turned upside down. And then finally, these from some Giotto paintings, some towers here in Arezzo, where I guess St. Francis is getting rid of the devils by shaking his stick or something. But the town is represented by its buildings, but the people in the town are represented by these buildings also. Each one its own personality. They're wonderfully simple and wonderfully powerful, for me at least. Sometimes they're a little silly. And next on the and next. This will be the least articulate of what's to come here, I think, or what has gone on. And it has to do with, God, it should be the clearest for what I'm about to say. I think I can draw it better than I can speak it. But it has to do with how do we want to speak with our architecture? Do we want to speak in distinct words, or do we want to slur the words? And I think that's a question facing us, or that's in the air at the moment. Does it mean? Is it between? I'll simplify. Do we follow a more classic tradition of making architecture in which there is a language, in which each of the parts is distinctly described and can speak clearly about what each part is about, or do we overlap words and more like an Altman movie in which lots of people are talking at the same time? The parts of this Etruscan temple were all known, understood, and all had significance. And they could be distorted in order to you make bigger columns, and it means something because the column has a normal size, a norm. Or you make the column smaller, and it means that it's more delicate because, again, there's a norm. When we started making things that had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of parts, and the parts were no longer understood but were only numbered, then we have a problem because we're no longer, and we do this with our architecture, we're no longer speaking the same language. And how are people to read our buildings? I tell this story quite often. This is a little. This was Craig's favorite toy as a child, as he says it. It should have been a movie camera, but it's a instead of an erector set, which has parts that are all sort of all the same, basically short rectangles, long rectangles, and little nuts and bolts, in which you can make anything you want to make. I mean, you can, just like a steel building, you can make, with these simple pieces of steel, columns and beams, you can make any shape, size building you want. This toy, which was a competitor with the erector set, had parts. Each one had its own identity. And you could put them together to make a bunch of different airplanes. The nice thing about these parts, or the nice thing about this little kit, was that the parts, because they had individual identity, when you assembled them, they retained that identity and gave the whole itself a distinct personality from another assemblage of them. And it's the story I like to tell is with the other kind of common toy that you have as a child of these play blocks. When the play blocks, if you're the second one along, as I was, the play blocks only consist of these squares and rectangles, and you end up being slightly unhappy because all you can make are these piles of blocks. You know, you think they're cities or you think they're buildings, and somebody says, "What is this?" Your parent comes by and sort of walks over them and says, "What is this?" And you say, "You stepped on my castle or something." They said, "Just looked like a pile of blocks to me." But my older brother had he had those wonderful blocks that had distinct shapes, or the few that were the half circles and the quarter circles and the triangular ones, and that really wonderful one, which was the part which was left over when you cut the half circle out. And he, although he's now doing photography, but when he was a child, he was basically making postmodern architecture, because he could assemble these things in all sorts of ways, and the little buildings or cities or airplanes or whatever he made had a kind of personality. The personality came from the personality of all the distinct parts. The parts could be read. And architecture. I mean, we've only had two ways to make architecture in the last 2,500 years. This way, in which all the parts were distinct and had names and so on, and the modern way, in which the parts, if they were there at all, were left up to each person's imagination. Are we moving towards another way of making architecture? I don't know. It's surprising that there's only been two. The wonderful thing about the distinct parts is that when you, and I don't know if I recommend this, but if you, it's when you overlay them over time, layer them, if you will, that you can get distinct readings of each one, and you don't have to have the whole part there to still know what it's about. It can be read through. If these forms were abstract, you wouldn't be able to read through, because you wouldn't know if it should continue or shouldn't continue. We used to like to make windows this way, and this is a kind of silly, slightly clumsy, but still wonderful window. The sides seem too thin, but for this funny hat it has. But nevertheless, it still is something that we like looking at. And then we started making, in a more expedient way, windows that were merely holes in the wall and almost randomly placed, to finally to windows that were like this. And how do these do speak? They speak like a Steve Reich piece of music, or an abstract painting, or they speak like the sounds that come out of a computer, and it has a wonderful quality. I mean, and it's mesmerizing, but it's hard for us to relate to, I think, and to understand. Okay. And next also. And next. This is a kind of a cell for an unknown architect. But I guess maybe for me this was one of the first times I saw how important and how important this was. Here was a sculptor, for this series at least, an artist who was making architecture. It's weird, you know, we accept that, but today we don't accept an architect doing art or an artist doing architecture. That's not because we can't do it, it's because it's something else in our society that doesn't allow us to go back and forth. Anyways, in Michelangelo's work, I think it's because he was so much so a sculptor and had dealt with things, objects as whole things, that when he started making architecture, he saw, and other people were doing the same, but he saw even more so that each one of the elements of architecture was like a piece of sculpture, was an object in itself. And the piece of sculpture, that object, whether it was a window or a door or a pediment, a part of a window, which is, again, a separate object, or a niche in the wall or a scroll, could communicate, could speak. Because, again, there were norms, there was an understood language, and the way it was portrayed, either quicker or slower, louder or softer, it could then start to tell a story and set a mood. And he liked to separate each one of these things and provide spaces for them, almost as if they were on display. Then here's a little sketch of a molding, and again, in this case, there's a kind of slight play here, but it's not even probably play, with the molding becoming the profile. Molding is a profile of a person's face. This side of the Laurentian Library stair, this perfect triangle, which then has a cascade of other perfect triangles on it. And the stair itself, way in the back of that slide, this is a side story here, but is this trace, because I think he did, there are two things in this room which are quite, for me, I don't know, I make up this story just because it sounds good, but that are quite extraordinary. The scrolls that are at the top of the slide. One of the scrolls is, because these things were, I guess models were made of them and drawings, and then some stone carvers would carve them. And one of the, and when he would go out, or any architect or designer would go out and sort of see the progress. And they were carved initially in a very pure, or for us, modern, abstract form. And anyone with eyes would have to like these, but they were not possible to do. They broke some rules which couldn't be broken. Well, one of the scrolls is fully carved in its elevation, but in the side elevation, the front elevation is fully carved. The side elevation, he left it absolutely flat in its kind of pure or abstract state. I always feel he sort of, and that wonderful triangle also on the side of the stair is a kind of anticipating a more abstract way of making architecture. And also, though, on this, this room once had a stair which, a stair which came down the side of the room, the back of the room behind the stair that you see in the slide. There was an old stair. And when he renovated the room, he, I guess as we do, liked to see buildings being sort of torn apart and the scars of time on them, as we see like stairs, traces of stairs in cities when they're tearing down a skyscraper. And he left the trace of the stair, as you can see on the upper part of the slide, and the moldings which come down that he designed and put in there come down to that point, and then they crumble away in a kind of wonderful way. And next. And I was going to give a slight spiel here for the classical language. Summerson does a better job at it than me. But I'll just say some very brief thing about it. What seems so wonderful about having a language to make buildings out of is that you can begin to speak with the object itself, with the space or spaces that it contains or surrounds and forms on the outside, and with all of the elements of the building. That we have a great burden to have a language, to invent that language for every building we do. And it's been a problem for us, I think. I don't know what a way out of that, except I think, and what I saw without really understanding, I don't understand the classical language, I don't know the names for all these things, but I do know that they found places, and these are like geometric places or formal places where things started to come together. And so that if you used, let's say, a Doric column which had a certain proportion of its width to its height, and then you spaced them a certain distance apart, it would seem like that these columns were standing there. Or if you placed them a little closer together and made them a little thinner, and they found an exact place for this, that they would seem to be galloping along. And I think those are absolutes. You don't have to put flutes on them in capitals, Corinthian capitals, but I think that there are some absolutes with things like spacings of, for instance, columns, and the proportion of the columns and so on. Well, this could go on for hours to explain that. And next. And finally, the last little thing before I show, I guess, 6 projects, which I'll show very briefly, is something to do with what you do with the location, the shape of the object, and the parts, how you organize both the parts within the whole and how you organize the parts with other parts, or the holes, excuse me, with other holes. And I guess the thing that I have started to call it is it has to do with alignments and the power of alignments of things. And as we all have maybe discovered in the last few years, rediscovered the power of an axis. In this slide on the left, this is Caparola. A wonderful thing occurs. As you know, the building is frontal to the long axis up the street of the town. The town unfolds. As you walk along the street, at the end of the town is the most important building on axis. This is good for a ruler, not good for you and I, if we aren't the ruler or don't believe in that, but this is the way they did things. When you walked up the stairs and the ramps and arrived at the front door, you could turn around. The form of the top stair is circular, almost circular. You turn around, you face back towards the town. There's a break in the buildings, as you see here. We're looking straight towards the front door on another axis. Where we're standing is the main church in this town, which is aligned with the front door of the house through this break in the buildings. A very simple gesture, but very powerful. And if you turn the other direction, there's a similar break in the buildings on the other side of the square, and you look out towards nature itself. And let me skip those and this. And then I will show, probably without explaining very much about them, 6 projects. 2 of them are built, 4 are completely undeveloped. One is a little more developed, the Venice Art Center, which Mark Mack and Jim Sterling seem to like. And I won't, somehow I guess I ask you to try to relate what I've sort of tried to talk about to these buildings. I won't sort of point to it so blatantly often. This is the gallery in Venice, a very simple building, 30 feet by 85 feet, and could be about 32 feet high. It has really just two parts. The front facade, which is designed to explain its relationship to the street, what the building is about, an art gallery and a residence, perhaps how the building is built and how circulation works in the building. And next. And next. The second main feature of the building is the center of the building itself. No room in a house seemed, at least in the modern house, and especially one that's sort of small, seemed to have the importance of having a spot marked as saying this room is most important. So we made a room which is really not a room at all, but a light well, a courtyard, which had this perfect form, a central spot. And next. I think if you just follow me on the, oops, changing slightly, trays. This is from the second story of the, looking into the courtyard. And generally on these, unless I say so, you just follow me on the, I'm speaking to this person on the slides. Except for that one. The plan is a kind of slightly hodgepodge of spaces centered around this, this one perfect shape. And next. Looking west. Next. And maybe focus also. Looking down into the courtyard, there's a moat of algae. Larry likes to raise algae. Larry is not here, I hope. Algae and dead fish. And next. When you come up to the top of the stairs, you find yourself at a spot which is right here, which is on axis with the courtyard and on axis with the central window in the west wall. Okay, hold this slide here. And also focus maybe, or I don't know, maybe it won't focus. This is a little apartment in New York for a patron. It was my best patron. This is the second apartment I did for them. The first one was a large, a wonderful space in the Lower East Side, 40 feet wide by 35 feet high by 80 feet long, one single space with a gantry crane going down and brick walls and possibility of light on three sides, including the south side. A wonderful opportunity with Walter Di Maria on the top two stories. It was going to be my big chance in New York. And just as I got settled on the design, they got divorced or separated, actually separated, and they called me and told me didn't buy the building after all, and they were because they were becoming separated and blah, blah, blah. And so about a year later, they got back together again. And and they kept calling up and saying, well, we're now going to build this. Can you do our apartment? It's a little embarrassing. It's only 1,000 square feet, although it's on Fifth Avenue, just opposite the zoo in Central Park. I said, well, okay, that sounds great. I mean, anything. I mean, my major commission this summer was my niece's playhouse, 40 square feet, a budget of $200. So it was a $20 commission. Okay, I made it. I worked on it a week. She had to build it herself. I worked on it a week and then called up just when I was really actually had a hard time doing it. And the funny thing is that when the design was exactly, I mean, I guess it's because it's the only thing you really do think of. But I was just in New Orleans, and one of the things they have out in their front lawns, these big mansions, sometimes are these playhouses. And I thought I had sort of an original design, and it's exactly the same as they've always been doing, which is a kind of temple, little temple, with a couple of columns in the front, as you would think of doing. Anyways, just when I got the thing designed, I called my brother and said that I just got it set and sending it off. He said, oh, well, we're going on a trip. We're going to have to cancel this project for this year. So, anyways, we started on this apartment. It was 1,000 square feet, and I got it designed and actually very far along this time. And George, I don't know, it was either George or Wendy, one of the two called up and said that they're separated again. And in fact, we're getting divorced. And they said, don't be so depressed. I was actually depressed the first time. The second time, I sort of knew thought it might be coming. And then, this summer though, I've met both of them, actually here in Los Angeles, and realized that this is so good. Because they were so great as patrons. They would say, well, just make great architecture. Don't worry about us. Don't worry about where we're going to, just, have a place for us to sleep. And let it, so that we can go in the door, but just make great art. I mean, there aren't many people like this, and George's supposed to have the bucks, so I realized this summer it's good at having them be divorced, because now I've got two patrons, and they both want houses once they get the divorce settlement. See who gets the most money. They both want something. George wants towers on a building in Soho, and Wendy wants a tower in Big Sur. Anyways, so this didn't get built. But on the right are three things that I was thinking about. The one which finally got actually designed. The two columns, which are here circular, are existing. The only feature, well, it's not even a feature, the only obstruction in the apartment, and had three windows facing basically west, southwest. And this one, which got out of control, this one was too weird for me to even think about much of it. I could draw it, but I couldn't understand it that well. Each one was trying to deal with the three windows in some way. Well, yeah, but go back to I guess. The apartment consists of a number of distinct spaces. I guess there are about 7 or 8. The ante-room, or lobby or foyer, the long gabled roofed room, which contains sort of kitchen and bathroom and library. I didn't seem to care too much what went on in these rooms. More to make, actually, I thought if you made a bunch of rooms that didn't seem like bedrooms or dining rooms or kitchens, that when you walked into the place, you would think to yourself that this place must be really big, because whereas the bedrooms must be somewhere else and the kitchen must be somewhere else. But seems like a silly rationale. Anyways, each part had its own distinct shape and set of materials, probably. I didn't get all that far. The first one, now you can switch, I guess. Yes, the lobby was I can use this actually now. Was a or foyer, was a room with a simple gabled roof with 4 doors in it. I can get back here. Oh, this doesn't show it. The room is made all of lead. The walls and the ceiling and the floor are all covered with lead here. It's actually healthier than you might think it to be. A weird thing is I called up the guy from the health department in Los Angeles who specialized in lead poisoning, and he thought it was a good idea. That seemed weird to me. Anyways, it seemed the only trick involved here, and I thought about it some, and I still haven't come to I mean, it's no big deal, but I haven't completely figured it out, whether it's a good thing to have done or not, was that that I put 2 doors to the apartment. Maybe I was foreseeing that they would get divorced or something. But one was a blank door and one was a real door, and it seemed to make the entrance to an apartment, which then is back axial again with the lobby. I mean, no big deal. It's a crappy little lobby. But it seemed to make that a little more special. And the other door, and if you can switch back, if that's possible. Yeah. Oh, God, it's out of control now. The other door had a kind of funny stair that just went up to nowhere, although they thought they were going to get another apartment in the building, although this stair wouldn't connect, actually. But it seemed like a nice thing to have in your foyer, which people always have in their foyers, a stair, and a good place to put your raincoat and purse and so on. Anyways, that was probably the only trick involved. I don't know whether tricks are good. It's a question whether we like Santa Claus better than the shepherd up on the hill, I think, in the way we make architecture. The long gallery had a glass ceiling with lights behind it, and the ceiling mullions were made of copper. New York has a lot of green copper when you're outdoors. And next, the main living room is really in 2 parts, a vaulted ceiling with 2 more columns to complete the 2 that are part of the structure of the building. And then splaying out with these funny large glass sort of doors, these rotating doors, is the rest of the living room with a kind of coffered ceiling. This is a ceiling plan, as you well know. And so it gave the living room access to all 3 windows. The living room wall itself, the end wall, was faceted with very deep reveals to hide all the radiators, and somehow was reaching out to Central Park with a large circular form. And then the 2 bedrooms were just merely on either side. The children's bedroom was a little bit like a little train compartment with the beds. And Wendy had this, which George hated, this Advent television that she wanted installed, or had one and wanted it installed above her bed. And somehow, by getting all the axes and the geometry right with the room, I looked at it one day and said, this looks like the lunar or the Apollo module, command module. And then I started liking putting the television screen right in front of it so they could both lie in bed and sort of sail through space, watching Dirty Harry or whoever else is in New York. And next. That's the floor plan. These are the plaster models of the apartment. Next. This is a house for, Susan's here. Identify yourself. If not, I can talk about you. For Susie Woozy. Susan and John, I guess we're calling it as a house for an artist and a doctor. John's a hippie doctor making $150,000 a year, 29 years old or whatever, and likes to smoke dope and play the guitar. And Susan makes, I hate doing houses because, God, who wants to know all this about other people's lives? I don't. Susan, Susan makes art, actually makes fairly good, decent art, but is a complete loon. But we love her. Go back one. This is very much like the Waterman apartment, but here it's in nature, and it just it's got actually some of the same forms because can't think of that many ideas, but here they just sort of. This was a strange building to design because they just got strewn about. In fact, I just started in this corner. And this is very close to the first drawing the only drawing I made of the house. They're not the only, the first drawing I made, which just started there and went out. And it has a lot to do with these very simple squares and golden section rectangles and so on, assembled together. Each of the forms has its own identity and reason for being there, or at least I thought so. It's on a sloped site, and the walls are actually battered slightly that they don't show in the model. And the little terrace, upper terrace with a funny little house with no roof is changed finally to this longer gallery with a larger building with stairs coming down. It doesn't seem important to know where things are in this house because, I don't know, they're so weird that they can sort of live anywhere they want to. Although I don't know why, this became also the kitchen, this gabled roofed shape back on the south side of the house. This is the second floor, which probably is a bedroom with a little, in the tower itself, a little bathroom with a stair going up to the top of the tower, and then a little perch out, looking out. Next, I think you follow me basically on these. And next. And then the upper building, finally, it became, oh, I can't, go back 2 slides on this. This juncture here, I don't know, for whatever it's worth. I could never work out. In fact, I'm not sure I ever did. But I finally, because I liked the little right angle and getting the courtyard to work and so on, and trying to mash all these weird shapes together and still have them be coherent. Both in section and in plan, the proportions of the spaces are all linked through, again, squares and golden sections and so on, which started to work in a really wonderful way. I haven't done this too often, but it really started to work for me. Anyways, this juncture, I finally, and next, by sort of these little funny little pointed things, which you may have seen before earlier tonight, seem to take some of the onus off of that corner and then frame the upper building, which is probably their bedroom or her studio, with a kind of loggia that then steps down into the courtyard. I'd hoped that it would be made out of, well, originally it was going to be a kind of tight wood on the outside, tightly fit wood, almost like a ship, as a low-budget building. That's the only problem. And then on the inside, plywood, all plywood, very simple, no beams or anything, and painted with a kind of wash. And then I switched, after building the model, to liking stucco, smooth stucco with the plywood on the inside, so that just the forms, both on the inside and the outside, were seen. And next. And next. Oh, back one. it's no big deal, but the stair leads to this spot, which then leads, or when you're at this spot, you look out. This is part of the alignments within the building itself. Lead out the front stair, or leads along this sort of axis of the upper part of the building, or leads directly up, and you can look up to the upper bedroom and look through the little hole in the wall, and it just becomes a special spot in the house, a spot which clarifies both the circulation of the house and the various places where the various rooms are. Concrete block for the floor. This was a project I did. It's quite undeveloped. It was a 250,000 square foot city hall for a competition in Canada. I did with some students down at Tulane in a week. So it's got some problems, but what and I have no drawings of it. The access was given by the competition, and the building had to answer to it in some way. The semicircle with the two sort of guard buildings became, which we started to call the guard dogs to the space, became quite important. And the two guard dogs and the two towers kind of formed a square within that circle. After all, the City Hall is the central building in the town. The two towers were actually cranes that could fold down and cover the square with a roof. The two kind of wandering buildings in the space, a bit like people, are one of them, I guess, we never could figure out what it was, this sort of Giotto tower. The other one was the tomb, was the archive of the city itself. And then poking through is the lobby on one side and the council chambers on the other side. It's about 12 stories. Next. And then the last two projects, if you have patience here. This is the one that we've worked on for 2 years, sort of on and off, and mostly off. So it's very undeveloped in terms of its architecture, in terms of, I think, the intentions and the geometry, especially of the plan. It's become quite clear to us. It's a place that probably you all know. It's in Venice, along Venice Boulevard. There's an old city hall, the kind of mission-style city hall, a mission city hall because the centers of cities used to be missions, and what's called the jail building, which is a kind of 30s modern building, Egyptian slightly, concrete, and quite a wonderful building. The city wants to tear it down in the way it loves to express its joy and admiration for architecture. It wants to tear both of these buildings down and put up a library. The library designed by the city people is a failing project in a first-year studio, failing in the first week of the first-year studio, amazingly poor. Well, you can look around the city and understand. Anyways, the organizations which occupy these buildings now, Beyond Broke, a poetry organization, SPARC, murals organization, and a theatrical group, which has no building here, but they have an office space, have no performing building, asked us to somehow accommodate the city's need for a library plus accommodate their needs. And so we put, which the city hates, I think, the library on the median strip with parking partly under it and partly farther down the median strip. And then left Beyond Broke in this city hall, seems appropriate. People like to use words, should be in a city hall, and left spark the arts organization in the jail, renegade artists, outlaws, and so on. I don't know. And then built two, or really three other structures in addition to the library building to surround and frame the two older buildings. The scheme basically is to frame the two older buildings, one by the long gallery at the bottom of the slide, which is a mural gallery, and secondly, obviously, by the arc, formed partly by next. It's less, the model has changed since this, but formed by the arc cut out of the vaulted library building. The main part of the library is on the upper floor, and a bit of the arc that's tied into a tower, or a kind of central pivotal tower, which then leads off to a bridge over to the library, or a ramp down into this rectangular courtyard. It's a kind of village, but it's a village which has its marker and its space clearly demarked. One of the things, I don't know, that we seem to like after a while, and it's no big deal, although it seems, and it comes a little bit from the Caparola experience, are the alignments of the various buildings as a way of joining these disparate objects. And hopefully, when all of them would get designed, they would all have a very different identity, although there would be some commonalities in terms of scale and materials, probably, and proportion of openings and columns, et cetera, et cetera. But each one would want to be its own personality. But they are then joined, as these arts groups are joined. They have their separate identities, but the aim is for them to be, at times, to be joined, are through the alignments, which are sometimes accidental, but often quite interesting. So that when you, let's say, stand at the foot of the City Hall, and with your back to the City Hall, and you're looking directly to the center of the library building, and you're standing here in the library, in the center, you can look back towards the City Hall, perpendicular to the City Hall, or perpendicular to the road. You look back to the door of the jail building. And there's a spot in the porte cochere of the jail building, which you look perpendicular to this axis up to the platform on the bridge. And the ramp itself, which is aligned to the tower, has a spot, a kind of platform on it, which you're allowed to stop, rest, and turn, and look perpendicular to the bridge, which then crosses it, and is aligned to the surface or entry surface to the library building. There's a light entry surface over here, which is also aligned to actually this spot here on the semicircular space. Chairs are not always good. Next. And next. There are a series of towers, or there's one that finally would be here on the gallery building, which is not on the model, in the City Hall itself with its tower, and then the tower sort of pivotal building. Next. And next. And I think you just follow me on these. This is a view from the library looking out towards the City Hall across Venice Boulevard. Next. And looking up into the theater. The theater has changed its axis so that it runs the other way, But let's see if this won't show anywhere. Although its facade is as the model is here. Next. The library building eventually, and I don't know whether it works here or not, is not a scarred, would not want to appear as a scarred building. It's a building which is about both being a vaulted building and a building which forms, helps to form a semicircular space, which then frames the two existing buildings. And the way that the structure works inside, the structure is not, it's designed in such a way, or would be, so that it would appear to be naturally accommodating both the vault and the semicircular cutout, so that it would not be, in fact, a harmed building, but a whole building with this peculiar shape. Next. From the parking, there's a long kind of gallery, which we saw as sort of study carols for the library, or special sort of rooms in the library, some sort of collection. Next. And next. And I'll go through these, which is a project you probably know already a bit, because we showed it 2 years ago, the Southside project. But I guess we didn't show any color photographs of it. But I'll go through this because we're approaching Hertzberger's record as quickly as I can. It's the final project. It's the Southside project. It's a community center in Columbus, Ohio. The site has these kinds of buildings surrounding it, very simple houses with little porches. This is the building they've been in for 75 years. They wanted a building which they could be in for another at least 75 years. They were a very interesting organization with a strong social and political philosophy. One of the very nice things about it for us, I guess the very best thing about it was they seemed to value interaction within the building over efficiency within the building. So they really were asking us to design an inefficient building that would support a number of different kinds of human interactions, from very private sort of one-to-one interactions to large gatherings. The first scheme, which I showed a couple slides of way back, was this very textural scheme made of 6 walls, which were then renovated, much like the bottom of the Colosseum in our minds. Basically provided a flexible field for present and future usage. The building, as it was built, we started over on the design because Craig and I had no new commissions and decided we might as well treat this as a new commission since the budget had decreased substantially. And rather than continuing with the old design, which was not possible, although I suggested that we just build these 6 walls and plant a lot of grass and put some cows out there, and the client actually considered hiring a local architect in Columbus at that point. Luckily, I think I was in Rome and Craig was in California, and he made friends with him again and then called me up and said, we have the commission again, which we decided to start over. He yelled at me something about courtyards over the phone, and I yelled back something about Villa Giulia, and that was basically the building came out of those 2 notions, which actually are one notion. And next. The building has a central building to it, which houses a kitchen and a dining room. It then has two courtyards. One is a real courtyard outdoors. The other is a courtyard which is then built over. It becomes a gymnasium. A third or a second building, a performing space, which you see in this slide here, or theater, forms the kind of entry building which leads into the courtyard, either through the ramp or a kind of side alley, which allows you to sneak into the courtyard. These four spaces, if you will, or two objects in two spaces, are then framed by two loft-like buildings. One's one story, the other's two stories. A way of looking at the building is the kind of carving out of space in a larger texture, with the central building being the object. Of course, it's not a real texture, and it has to be it finally does have to have its limits. And the model with the roof off really shows the simple idea for the building. The central building is, as you can see here, kind of bracketed by these curved walls, which are the same geometry as the vault of the central building, and the curved wall of the theater proscenium wall, which you'll see later on. Next. The building has both two central ideas, and obviously it has a kind of cross axis that runs through the central building. The main axis runs along and joins the four spaces which I just described. Along with the central building, we'd never called it a central courtyard, but only simply the courtyard, because there's none other. The courtyard has two objects facing it: the central building and the theater proscenium, or the curved wall which acts as a foil for the theater building behind it, which is twisted slightly. Why it's twisted slightly, I don't know. We were twisted at that time, I think. We were also trying to, Columbus was a boring place and is a boring place, and I don't know, maybe it's a good place to make twisted buildings. And then finally on the third side, or the two sides, are two identical building shapes, which are these long walls, a bit like what they used to do during the Renaissance to kind of frame out existing Romanesque churches or Gothic churches, or medieval town halls with their Renaissance sort of wall-like buildings to form a space. Next. The four hard-to-read spaces in this drawing